Hello and welcome to the Sustainable Solutions webinar series, brought to you by the Master of Science in Energy Policy and Climate Program, the Master of Science in Environmental Sciences and Policy Program, and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a discussion on perspectives on decarbonization with green H2. My name is Natalie Cross, and I'm the event producer. Please note today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Sustainable Solutions playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function or chat, and we will answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the presentation to our moderators, Dr. Dan Zachary, Program Director and Senior Lecturer for the Master of Science in Energy Policy and Climate Program, and Rachel Issacs, Program Coordinator and Lecturer in the Master of Science in Environmental Sciences and Policy Program.
Dan, did you want to go first?
Yeah. Good evening, everyone, and hopefully you can hear me okay. I know there's a little bit of bandwidth issue, but welcome to tonight's event. I wanted to make a little publicity for an upcoming event before we jump into the main event this evening. I'm going to put it in the chat just so that you see it. We have HOP25, Helping Our Planet 2025, coming up on the April 12th. There's a sign up, an event in the chat. Feel free to do that if you haven't done so already. It will be a free event that'll be both online and on site. We have several, actually many, a couple dozen speakers that will be doing keynotes, panel discussions, and parallel sessions, as well as workshops on the topics of climate, the environmental issues, and energy technologies and state-of-the-art technologies addressing different issues that are current. We will obviously address things that are current events, as you can imagine. And we are excited about the event, and we do wish you and hope that you can come and join us. It'll be an exciting event all day, Saturday, April 12th. Thank you. And I'll turn it back to Rachel.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to our second in the series, our Sustainable Solutions series. It is my pleasure to introduce Parag Nathaney, who has amassed a decade of experience in green hydrogen development, wholesale electricity markets, renewable energy, and energy storage. He currently works as a principal advisor at Fortescue's market intelligence team in North America. This is where his focus is on standing up green hydrogen production to facilities in the U.S. His previous experiences include electricity market modeling to support trading, origination, and policy development for Constellation. As a consultant, he has also led commercial due diligence for power portfolio transactions and developed commercial strategies to support energy transition investments for various private equity and financial sector clients. During today's talk, we're going to have an engaging discussion on the adoption of specifically of green hydrogen, or H2. This is a great decarbonization solution for hard-to-abate sections like heavy-duty trucking, steel, and refining. Parag will review other decarbonization alternatives, identify the most competitive applications for green H2, and highlight the need to address gaps from a policy and regulatory perspective to promote green H2 adoption. If at any point in time you all have questions, please again feel free to put those questions in the chat or in the Q&A. And with that, I will pass it over to Parag.
Thank you for that. Good evening, everyone. I'm glad you could make the time to join this event. Appreciate all your attendance. Before I start, I just wanted to put one thing out there as a disclaimer. So all the views and material that's published here, doing this in personal capacity and doesn't reflect in any shape or form the views of my employer. And with that out there, I will share my screen. Just let me know when that's visible. I'll go into presentation mode. that good?
It is visible.
Great. So yeah, I'm as my intention or my introduction mentioned, I'm part of the Market Intelligence team at Fortescue North America. And for those of you not aware, Fortescue is the world's fourth largest iron ore mining company, and it has plans to become an integrated metals, energy, and technology company with a focus to get to net zero Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions by 2030. So I'm glad that I have this opportunity to share my perspectives and learning so far on how green hydrogen can fit into the decarbonization options that hard-to-abate sectors have, and where does green hydrogen fit in. So without further delay, I'll just get started on some of the core learnings that I've had in my current role. I've already covered this. So for today's discussion, the focus is how does it's basically a practitioner's view. So what I've learned from being in this space for about 2 years now, where does green hydrogen fit in? What I've learned about the propensity of green hydrogen adoption by various hard-to-abate sectors. How does a industrial offtaker think about decarbonization more broadly? Under what sort of regulatory and policy environment is green hydrogen operating that either advances it or inhibits it? And under all these sort of considerations where you have to produce a molecule that a potential offtaker may or may not need depending on their decarbonization needs, how do you develop projects under some level of uncertainty? And what is the potential for like long-term success? Like how do we identify sectors where use of green hydrogen makes more sense? So we'll touch upon these aspects as we go through this presentation. So first and foremost, when we think of hard-to-abate sectors, by hard-to-abate, I mean sectors that do not have easy ways to decarbonize through electrification. So steel making, for example, or fertilizer production, cement, heavy-duty transportation, marine transportation, aviation. There isn't enough even though battery technology is advancing, there are limitations to how much electrification one can expect in these sectors. And hydrogen can come in as an option for decarbonizing these sectors. But when a sector is considering what its decarbonization journey is going to look like, there are basically two factors that have that kind of take priority. A company's approach is typically guided by these two questions. What is the cheapest and the easiest way to reduce emissions by any volume? And second, what actions result in the biggest reduction in the total volume of emissions? So even when I say that hard-to-abate sectors cannot be easily electrified, there are other options that these industries could consider when they are considering how they can decarbonize. And hydrogen adoption will only work in places or will materialize the earliest in those sectors where either it is the cheapest and the most cost-effective option to reduce emissions, or it creates the most impact, like you get the most bang for your buck, essentially. So that's where hydrogen use will materialize most naturally. Other participants may have, or like other certain players in the sector might have different climate ambitions, so they can have a different view on how they want to define cost effective. But that's generally how any sector would first approach this question, like what is the cheapest and what is the easiest action, and how effective it is, and what results in the biggest impact of in emission reduction. And what I've learned from baselining several sectors and also talking to various key players who are involved in implementing decarbonization solution for their industries, like a lot of times green hydrogen doesn't tend to be the most easiest decarbonization option. So the chart here at the bottom is basically showing the total supply chain emissions associated with um, uh, uh, agriculture. And the gray bar on the right is related, that's around 1129 metric tons of CO2 equivalent, 1129 million tons of CO2 equivalent, sorry, is what's attributed to the supply chain of fertilizers. That's only 10% of total emissions from agriculture sector. The rest 90% is unrelated to use of nitrogen-based fertilizers. And even within that total emissions that are attributed to fertilizer supply chain, only 439 million tons of CO2, or only 4% of total agricultural emissions can be attributed to fertilizer production. So when I say, okay, when we consider that, okay, there is green hydrogen produced through electrolysis of water using renewable energy with a zero carbon intensity, there's a zero carbon intensity molecule as compared to the conventional option, which is using natural gas to make hydrogen. If I'm a fertilizer producer, or if I'm a, let's say, food company that wants to decarbonize, and if green hydrogen is proposed as a solution as an input to produce green ammonia, which can then be translated into other fertilizers, it would be a very small piece of the puzzle that I'm addressing, right? So green hydrogen doesn't tend to be like the lowest hanging fruit for decarbonization option, especially in agriculture. Lot of the agriculture, so a food company, when it's considering decarbonization practices, its first choice is not to say, oh, I will use fertilizers made from green hydrogen. What I can do is do better, efficient cropping practices, improve tilling practices. There's a lot more in terms of like low-hanging fruits that would involve like process change or tweaking efficiency of processes that can basically create more impact in the short term, rather than transitioning to like green hydrogen from the very onset, where it becomes a could be very costly to implement and doesn't also create the most sort of impact for your emission reduction. So another example is in cement. When cement, the process of making cement, right? Like the 90% of concrete related emissions come from clinker production for cement, which is production of clinker basically involves a mix of limestone and other minerals that are heated at very high temperatures in a kiln and that process basically releases CO2. The process itself releases a lot of carbon dioxide. And the only part where green hydrogen can come in is to substitute process heat. So instead of using coal or natural gas, if I were to use green hydrogen as a heating source, that would produce low carbon intensity cement. But that only addresses, that's a partial solution to the problem, because the process itself produces so much CO2 emissions. As a cement producer, my first tendency would be, oh, if I can capture CO2 emissions from cement production through carbon capture, that would address a lot of emissions from the process itself. So that would be like a natural choice that a cement producer would gravitate to, a more climate conscious cement producer would gravitate to. But even before doing that, there are better sort of construction practices which require less concrete, using less cement while making concrete, or having substitutes for cement that would be impactful in reducing emissions. And if I was using coal to produce that heat in the kiln where cement was being processed, where limestone was being processed, going from coal to natural gas is a 50% reduction in emissions. Or if I don't want to use natural gas, then using renewable natural gas or some form of biogas it also allows for incremental emission reductions. And cement makers in Europe and Canada have already started doing this by transitioning first by producing cement substitutes or using less limestone for cement production, finding similar materials that have less carbon impact. And the second is swapping out coal with renewable natural gas to produce cement, and then that could qualify as at least 40-50%. That production process would lead to at least 40-50% reduction in in emissions associated with cement production. So this is another example where green hydrogen, even though has a great sort of thermal value or produces no emissions when being used for heat production, doesn't fit the bill because there are better alternatives, or there's just other low-hanging fruits that the industry would likely adopt before considering green hydrogen as its option. So with that in mind, there are these challenges to the sector, right? Like the off-takers always have options, and green hydrogen tends to be one option amongst the menu of decarbonization options. But there is policy impetus, or there's certain level of policy support to deploy green hydrogen, not just in US, but across Europe and Asia, where countries are like serious about their decarbonization journeys and have certain net zero commitments. Green hydrogen is expected to play an important role. So on the surface, there are lots of policies that should help. And the following slide provides a sort of an overview where green hydrogen deployment is being supported through, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US provided a $3 per kg production incentive for lowest carbon intensity form of hydrogen production, that is green hydrogen. In Europe, there is directives to there are directives to decarbonize ammonia production or ammonia that's consumed in the US through ammonia that's consumed in European Union through the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And the RED 3 guidelines require 42% of hydrogen consumed in the Europe to be of non-biological origin, or to basically be green in nature by 2030. Japan and Korea also have come out with prioritizing use of hydrogen in the form of ammonia as a substitute or as a blend with coal. These Asian economies have coal plants that are relatively young, less than 15 years old, that they would need to find ways to at least extend the life of these assets to or use them through their use these assets through their useful life, or face impairment. So these economies are figuring out solutions that they can use to lower the carbon intensity of their coal fleet, and basically are using hydrogen and hydrogen derivatives for power applications. So this is a helpful policy environment, but when you can kind of start looking a little deeper into the sort of actual implementation of these policies, there's still a lot of like uncertainty related to if these incentives will materialize, or if they will actually be sufficient to help green hydrogen production scale globally. For example, in the US, the 45V production tax incentive that was part of the Inflation Reduction Act was very well intentioned to allow to incentivize lowest carbon intensity hydrogen production with a pretty generous incentive. But to capture that incentive, the green hydrogen needed to be produced with renewables that we needed to be produced with renewables, and not just existing renewables, but new renewables that can be delivered within a certain geographic area, and the hydrogen production needed to be aligned with renewable generation that's powering the process. So basically, you're looking at a production process that's very variable, that is aligned with renewable production, and any sort of capital intensive production process does not like variability. Like electrolyzers that are used to produce hydrogen can ramp up or down, but there's a lot of capital that has been invested to install those electrolyzers. And as a green hydrogen producer, it would be better to run it full out and run it all the time to make sure that your capital is being optimized on. But inherently, 45V, as the final rules came out, or the IRA's final rules, basically restricted how one could run an electrolyzer by tying the electrolyzer operations to renewable operations. So intermittent or variable renewable supply would lead to variable production. So one would need much higher volumes of much higher storage to make sure that ultimately the off-taker that would consume that product gets steady supply of the product. No industry likes their raw material to be varying in nature. If I'm a fertilizer producer, I need hydrogen. I need it as a constant stream of gas rather than an output that varies over time, or as an input that varies over time. Like chemical processes aren't designed to ramp up and down with your sort of input supply. So that all implies a higher cost product, because you have to invest a lot more in storage if the production is going to be variable. Even though the US has great demand side or like production incentives, there is very limited demand side push for adoption, because no industry, a lot of the compliance for emission reductions is on a voluntary basis, and the hope is market mechanisms would create a product that's cheap enough to be adopted, and industries would ultimately switch to the lower carbon alternative when it's cost competitive. Over the long run, that is how technology advancement should proceed, and eventually make green hydrogen or low carbon hydrogen competitive with conventional options. It's never going to be cost competitive to natural gas derived hydrogen, green or blue, or any hydrogen that is not derived from natural gas is going to have additional costs. But at least that cost gap would be small enough for, let's say, a slightly more climate conscious industry to adopt the low carbon alternative. But there aren't any sort of immediate near-term measures to allow for adoption on the demand side to help the industry get off the ground. And I don't want to belabor this point, but generally, like with the administration changes and the potential the overturning of the Chevron deference by the Supreme Court, there's a possibility that the rules as written under the IRA may be challenged, and there will be protracted sort of legal battles to get resolution on what the final rule should look like. So that all that uncertainty doesn't help the solution to scale. No business or no technology solution technology solution would like some level of certainty on how much or how it's going to be adopted over time. And green hydrogen doesn't have that sort of luxury at this time. But when you think of the domestic market and the uncertainties associated with it, I talked about mandates or incent mandates in Europe, the programs in Asia. But when you look deeper into those, even those have their own challenges and lack of clarity, especially in European Union. The mandates for green hydrogen adoption by 2030 were set at the Commission level, but each member country has to adopt that mandate and implement the policy and develop its own targets and sectors where that mandate would apply. Those rules were expected to be finalized by 2024, 2025, or at least by the end of this year. But there's very limited sort of traction in finalizing those rules. Only 2 countries have come out with some sort of draft legislation demonstrating the implementation of the RED III standards. Because there are other sort of competing priorities in Europe, and especially political sort of environment in Europe is also changing. So that also creates uncertainty if member states will actually comply with the mandate, or they might need more time. In 2030 may be too optimistic. Maybe 2035 or 2040 would be a realistic timeline. The same in Japan and Korea. There is a preference for price, and the procurement for clean hydrogen and its derivatives is not, there's no carve out for green. It's all based on price, and hydrogen produced through carbon capture could be more, is definitely cheaper and is more cost competitive than green to meet the needs of those markets. So the scenario here is we have challenges from the offtake, or like green hydrogen has a sort of, it can be applied to a lot of sectors, but it has challenges in being adopted because each sector has their own consideration. The policy environment is shifting. There's a lot of uncertainty around ultimate sort of mandates being applied, or ultimately how these policies are realized. So how does actually one develop projects in a scenario like this? How does one find the sort of right opportunity set to make this technology work? And some sort of core principles, or some core principles that have emerged that help that are important for successfully executing projects, at least at this stage, to get the industry off the ground and to kind of be the first of a kind large scale green hydrogen production unit. There are 2 ways. One, design with the greatest flexibility, having the most optionality on how where that hydrogen can ultimately go, have more sort of integrated production and offtake. So essentially the idea is to bring production of green hydrogen and demand for green hydrogen almost at the same point, to avoid long distance transport, unless you can build a pipeline, which is possible. But generally projects need to start from both from the offtake perspective. I think that's where the crux lies, where you can identify downstream customers who have a willingness to pay for a premium product, where green hydrogen is a small part of the overall production cost of the end product. And that low carbon intensity green hydrogen, when it adds a premium to the final end product, that premium can somehow be monetized in the end use market. One example is renewable diesel refining. The California LCFS market has varying levels of carbon intensity that a renewable diesel product could qualify for. And if a renewable diesel refiner uses green hydrogen, they get higher LCFS value because they are abating a lot more carbon than the conventional process, and that LCFS value then is an incentive to cover certain costs of the green premium that's associated with green hydrogen integration. The other idea is to basically co-locate green hydrogen production with new industrial complexes to avoid transportation challenges, especially like trucking green hydrogen over long distance is a challenge. Pipeline is more feasible, but there are challenges associated with pipeline development. Again, with any sort of large infrastructure projects, there are challenges around NIMBYism. Having rights of ways secured. So pipeline development is challenging, but if you can find a way to bring your off-taker to the production site, that helps create more certainty for adoption, limits transportation, keeps costs low, and enhances adoption potential. And that could largely be done for new industrial facilities that may be looking for a site. For example, a steel maker wants to set up a plant in the United States. Would it be better for the steelmaker to work or like be co-located with a green hydrogen producer to produce green steel with hydrogen? If that's a consideration, then that should be a priority. Like, how do I find a site where there is enough green hydrogen production to make green steel? On the upstream element, which is finding sites where you can get enough renewable supply that will enable the electrolyzer to run at least 70-80% of the time. Basically, you're looking to secure geographic sites with complementary wind and solar profiles, and then co-locate hydrogen production with those renewable sites to avoid transmission and delivery charges. That helps keep your power costs low, eliminates the transmission costs, which can add up to be quite substantial. And this is important to find like even the smallest cost savings on the power side, because power costs are around 60 to 70% of the operating expense of a green hydrogen production facility. And electrolyzers could be flexible. So any ways, new electrolyzers tend to have some level of flexibility. So any possibility of flexing the electrolyzer demand up or down to monetize on grid conditions, like performing some level of demand response, always adds value. So this is a pretty like narrow opportunity set in where first of a kind projects in this sector could work. Finding the right off-taker, finding the right sort of renewable sites, bringing the offtake and green hydrogen production together, and integrating the production of green hydrogen with renewables. So there's, as you can see, there is a lot of complexity involved. A lot of elements in this value chain need to work together to ultimately make a site or a project success. And that takes time. So I didn't want to like be demotivating and saying there is only challenges in the sector, but I do want to acknowledge that for any decarbonization option or any climate solution is not going to have it's not going to be cheap and easy. Even the other technology options that are out there, the more let's say new nuclear, small modular reactors, carbon capture, direct air capture, all these technologies have pretty significant costs associated with them. So decarbonizing is going to be a great investment opportunity, but needs policy certainty and commitment from end use to make sure that some of that investment are eventually do materialize and create long-lasting impact. But I think this last slide is sort of a metric that I think can be applied to any decarbonization technology out there. Because what is the technology ultimately doing? It's replacing the incumbent fuel source or heat source? And how do you think about what is an effective way to consider all the decarbonization options that that an off-taker or a hard-to-abate sector has? And using a metric, simplifying sort of metric called like cost of carbon avoided helps put things in perspective. So when considering all the, and for example, this chart here on the right is what I was able to develop for green hydrogen. So when you're considering potential applications for green hydrogen and its derivative, this is an important lens, the inferred cost of emissions avoided that result from switching to green molecule. So the idea is, what was my incumbent fuel? How is green hydrogen replacing that? What is the emission intensity of the incumbent fuel? And how much green hydrogen is needed to create the same amount of heat as the incumbent fuel? So when you consider all these factors and start sort of mapping or plotting what is the cost of carbon avoided by fuel switching, that gives you one sort of metric to consider when considering other decarbonization options that are available. But in addition to just the cost of carbon avoided, there's also an element of process change or CapEx required to integrate green hydrogen into your process. And that would be a qualitative metric in my mind. Let's say ease of adoption is how I would categorize it. If integrating green hydrogen does not require significant process change or equipment change, or does not require a lot of capital expense to integrate green hydrogen into my production process, then that is that's an easy switch to make. But if there's new pipeline that needs to be developed, if my production process needs to be retrofitted with different kind of burners or heat sources, then that's a difficult adjustment or difficult switch to make, because that would require not just fuel switching, but also additional capital investment in changing equipment. And that is essentially creates sort of a high barrier for adoption, or creates low ease, and it is classified as low ease of adoption. So ideally, a decarbonization option should fall in the third quadrant, where the ease of adoption is high and the cost of emissions avoided is low. And the cost of avoided emissions is low. So basically, I can cheaply integrate a new solution, and that is very inexpensive in terms of the avoided carbon costs that it creates. A lot of the applications for green hydrogen, they don't tend to fall in that bucket, but there are applications like iron and steel, heavy duty transport, and refining, which let's say are less than $200 per ton in terms of cost of carbon avoided, but have some challenges associated with getting the hydrogen to these facilities. For example, for iron and steel, if as an incumbent iron and steel producer or steel producer, I was using coal, switching to green hydrogen would require a complete redesign of the process and the furnace that's involved. Same for heavy duty transport, and this is based on swapping out or like fuel switching from diesel to green hydrogen. On a fuel equivalent basis, the cost of avoided emissions is $82 per ton, but switching over to a hydrogen fuel cell from a diesel truck would require buying a new fuel cell truck, making sure the refueling infrastructure is there in place to refuel the fuel cell truck, making sure that hydrogen gets delivered to the refueling station when you need it. And so that's where like the most potential lies, but that's also where a lot of investment is needed upstream to make sure hydrogen delivery and use becomes easy. In the second quadrant, or the top left aspect, and in the top left corner of this chart, this is where hydrogen and its derivatives are being used to make, hydrogen is being used to make methanol for shipping, or hydrogen is being used to make synthetic methane, which is basically using CO2 from carbon capture and reacting it with green hydrogen to produce synthetic methane. The same for sustainable aviation fuel, either produced through carbon capture or some other form, and using ammonia as chemicals. All these applications, hydrogen can basically be like in especially in e-methane, there is no infrastructure change required. Existing natural gas infrastructure would work perfectly fine for using synthetic methane. But that is a pretty premium, that's a pretty significant premium in terms of cost of avoided emissions, almost $1,000 per ton. And that's when the offtaker starts to think, is that the best value for my money? Can I achieve different sort of emissions, or can I do something else with a same sort of, with even better impact and less investment in adjusting for green hydrogen? So, but I think when you consider long-term options, a lot of these sectors run out of options very quickly. Like you can't electrify shipping. If aviation needs to decarbonize, and companies are or airlines are committed to decarbonizing without offsets, and quality of offsets is always questionable in some cases, then there are a few alternatives, and one has to be prepared to like think about what is the most impactful option, and if green hydrogen is one and you're committed enough for your climate ambition, then using green hydrogen would make sense. So in the long term, sectors like steel and road transport would create the most impact. Shipping, use of ammonia for shipping or methanol for shipping using green hydrogen is valuable, but then there are, as I said, alternatives going from, let's say, fuel oil in ships to LNG is at least a 40-50%, 25 to 30% reduction in emissions, which is what a lot of companies would consider good enough as the first step. So it's up to, I guess, individual organizations, their commitment, and how serious and how committed they are. But there are sectors where the long-term potential for green hydrogen is where green hydrogen is still like a viable option for decarbonization. So I'll pause there. That's a lot of information, but happy to field questions.
Thank you so much, Parag. For anybody who has any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat or in the Q&A. I will start with the first one that popped up from Kavita. What policies can be implemented to initiate decarbonization efforts, particularly through green hydrogen, in countries that heavily rely on natural gas for their petrochemical sector and where renewable energy has not yet fully been commercialized?
Policy instruments. I think that this is where creation of market mechanisms that value low carbon intensity products would work. So, for example, I mentioned low carbon fuel standards in California. There is a declining emission caps on the transportation sector, but there's also incentives for producers who can produce renewable diesel or produce diesel alternatives with lower carbon intensity than conventional diesel. And that lower carbon intensity is valued through avoided carbon, through a LCFS credit that is reflective of the carbon that's avoided from the alternative process. So mechanisms where policy mechanisms that can create that can create market structures or not in mandates, but incentives for markets to incentivize low carbon intensity product use, that would be useful. In areas which rely on like natural gas for the petrochemical sector, and renewable energy has not been commercially materialized, I think a lot of I think any decarbonization trajectory or journey begins with efficiency. Like what you can do most efficiently if there's leaks in the system, if there is wasteful use in the system, that is the lowest cost, most carbon effective way of, or most effective way of reducing emissions. So anything that you can find that enhances efficiency, that's the first step. Second is there are alternatives or like biomass or bio alternatives that can be the next step. That is slightly more expensive, but you run into scale issues for any of the bio-based mechanisms. For example, even for producing sustainable aviation fuel, ethanol, corn ethanol, or corn stover can be a feedstock to produce sustainable aviation fuel. But to meet the decarbonization challenge, and if all the volume of aviation fuel needs to be decarbonized, you run into scale challenges with bio-based incentives soon. But there's still enough that would get you to, let's say, 40, 50, even 60% reduction in emission intensity in some cases. And then going to that, like the golden real zero, net zero is where like green hydrogen can come in. So efficiency, bio-based incentives, electrification wherever possible, even if it's not renewable powered, even if it's natural gas powered, and if it's helping swap out a process that was using oil to natural gas fired electricity, that is a significant step forward in terms of reducing emissions. Yeah.
Thank you. We have both a nice comment and a question from Gannon. Thank you for first and foremost emphasizing that before we look at decarbonization efforts via hydrogen production, we must increase efficiency and point source reduction. The question is, for the cost chart that you showed, for thermals, is hydrogen energy production being used to decarbonize the methane production, or is it being used as a substitute for methane?
It's a substitute for methane. So the dot in the right, in the first quadrant is use of hydrogen as a alternative for natural gas. And that is possible, but like the rule, but the challenge there is hydrogen has 1/3 the energy density of natural gas when it's considered in a gaseous form. So for every to produce the same unit of heat, you need 3 times as much hydrogen as you would need natural gas. And the rule of thumb, based on sort of the heat intensity of the two fuels and the heat per volume sort of metric, like $1 per kg hydrogen, which will be like the moonshot or the gold standard for green hydrogen to reach. Challenges to get there, but $1 per kg is cheap enough for wide scale adoption. That itself, when you translate it in terms of like natural gas cost, that is equivalent to like $8 per MMBTU. So natural gas for $3 to $4 in the commodity market, delivered natural gas in like commercial and residential homes, commercial and residential application, that's like $5, maybe $6 per MMBTU. So hydrogen is at least for the same amount of heat, you're basically paying almost double than what the commodity price is. MMBTU of heat from natural gas would cost you only $4 today, while an MMBTU of heat from hydrogen will cost you almost $8. So that's where the challenge lies in adopting hydrogen for pure thermal applications. So like, heating homes or creating heat for industrial processes. It's not the greatest use of a valuable resource. Like green hydrogen is very valuable for decarbonizing sectors where it can make the most impact. I think if we want to decarbonize natural gas use, an easier alternative would be to use renewable natural gas, or even just direct electrify wherever possible and source more renewable energy to electrify that process.
Thank you. Second question is, what do you think are the limitations of this type of infrastructure from largely developing in the global South, like South America and Africa, education and infrastructure costs?
Right. So I mean, this developing green hydrogen infrastructure is, it's not for the faint-hearted. It's very capital intensive, has a lot of like technology and policy risks associated with it, at least at this stage. Those factors basically get compounded in some of those regions where there's even like the political instability or policy uncertainty. I mean, even in developed economies, policy uncertainty is kind of is pretty substantial in this time and age. I think, yeah, getting those factors aligned is going to be tough in some of those regions, but some of those regions have the best resources. And then it's up to the off-taker to do their due diligence in making sure that the right sort of labor practices are followed and getting the right sort of certification schemes in place for production of green hydrogen or its derivatives in these places is important. Like certification is anyway important for like wide scale adoption in markets in the European Union based markets. But then making sure that those certifications are credible in these places, that would be a challenge, or like that could be remedied with sort of reliable, faithful certification schemes.
Thank you. A question from afar from Lama is there tends to be a controversy with green hydrogen production, specifically in that it uses fresh water. And so how does the industry, how do you address the challenges in kind of implementing this new decarbonization process, particularly in areas where there's water scarcity, like island nations or in particularly arid environments?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely like relevant. Yes. If the industry claims to be like, the industry claims to be like the climate champion or like create climate positive impact, then definitely water and its sourcing is important. So avoiding regions with water stress or finding ways to replenish water that's being used over time, like water conservation practices would be important. I honestly, personally, I don't feel like going into water starved areas would be a good idea, because that, again, that's not just good for the environment, that's also not good for the project if ultimately over the long term, one of your factors of production or your input variables or inputs into the production process is at risk of being reliable, then yeah, avoiding screening for areas where you have basically, in terms of factors of production, low water stress, great renewable availability, and if you want to layer on offtake potential, then you'll have the right sort of geographic scoping to ensure that the project is successful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I think we have time for one more quick question.
Sure.
Is there's a little bit of a concern with the fact that it is a very flammable product. And so how do they address the, transportation, storage in specific containers? How does that whole process work to ensure safety? Where would the plants be developed or built, away from populations for safety?
Yeah. That is, some of the concerns are overstated, at least in terms of like there are technology solutions to compressing hydrogen, liquefying it, and using transportation carriers to transport that liquid. Those technologies have been available for quite some time and have been tested and verified and certified. the transporting hydrogen via pipelines in pipelines that are designed specifically for hydrogen transport, that shouldn't be a problem, because there's been years of scientific research and testing that is being done on that, and the parameters are well known. Retrofitting pipelines would require retrofitting gas pipelines to carry hydrogen for some level of blending. Yes, that is challenging. That would require additional compression on the system. The pipeline material, if it's cast iron, will need to be changed to PVC. So I don't think there is enough sort of appetite anyway to do hydrogen transportation through existing natural gas networks. It just adds complexity and cost, and pipeline companies don't have the incentive to do it right now. But having dedicated pipelines with established safety protocols and transporting liquid hydrogen through specialized carriers that exists, and is feasible and safe.
I think we have about a minute for one last question.
Sure.
From Venera. What do you think about, related to the freshwater, going back to freshwater,
Mhm.
what do you think about using wastewater in regions with scarce freshwater?
Yeah, I mean, definitely water sources, wastewater can be used. It requires purification, desalination, making that sure that the water is of the appropriate level, or appropriate standard and purity level for the electrolyzer to accept it. It can be done. It's just that doing that adds to the cost. Green hydrogen is anyway a premium decarbonization option. So adding to the production cost makes the product even more expensive, shrinks the sort of available market for adoption. So it can be done, but it would need support and sort of policy incentives policy commitment to use wastewater for hydrogen production. If we can somehow manage production costs, then yeah, and produces a product that's in a desirable price range for offtake, yeah, sure, we should do that. Or we could do that. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you so much. Thank you so much for giving this talk, and thank you everybody who has participated and joined us for this talk. As we wrap up, one final reminder that we do have the HOP Symposium coming up on April 12th, and we hope to see everybody there. And feel free to always send us any extra questions you might have, and we can always pass them along to Parag after the event.
Yeah.
Thank you,
We should
everybody.
take more time. Thank you for the opportunity. Take care.